Just to start, so my name's Evelyn. I'm the Regional Program Manager for NVU here in Kenya. And let me start with some housekeeping. The format of the session is quite straightforward. I will give a mini introduction on NVU, and my colleague Kenneth will present findings for the main body of the webinar. And then we are keen to dive into a lot of questions and have interaction at the end. So we'd love to hear your thoughts, as well as, if you have ideas on how to collaborate. Perhaps at this point, it would actually be nice to have everyone drop their name, their title and organization. So a small introduction in the chat box, so we all know who's in the room. And now the chat box is, if you look at the top of your Teams, it's on the left, you see a little balloon with chat. But then to streamline the Q&A session, I want to actually ask you to drop your questions in the Q&A part of Teams, which is also at the top, but a bit more in the middle. And this will really help us with kind of streamlining the questions at the end. You can do this throughout the whole webinar, and we'll collect and address in the final part. At the end of the presentation, I will also drop a link in the chat, so you can then download the full issue analysis publication. And then lastly, the session, the webinar, will be recorded and distributed later on as well. Yeah, so I think with that, we are set to dive in. And as promised, I'll to put everything into a little bit of context, I'll share a brief background about NVU. And so I'm going to move the slide, and NVU essentially is an impact venture building studio where we build ventures to positively change the world. So we're established in 2004, but effectively been building ventures as we're doing now since 2010. And our current venture portfolio is around 24 ventures. And so as you can see here, we are a global company with offices in India, Indonesia, the Netherlands, and in Chile, in addition to Kenya. And the key focus of our work in Kenya is around food systems. And in the other regions, we focus on some other big themes like plastics, textile, mainly plastic waste, textile waste, and circular mobility. There is some cross-pollination, but every area kind of has a main focus that the team locally is focusing on. Now, on to the why, how, and what we're doing. Our vision is really that basically impact-driven entrepreneurship is the key to an economy that is or that positively and sustainably enriches the lives of all people, and also sustainably utilizes the valuable resources that we have available to us on our planet. And so when you have an impactful and sustainable and scalable business model, it keeps growing, it keeps expanding, keeps creating impact, and that's really the key to lasting change. And so at NVU, we design and ideate and create and build such companies in-house. And we decide what needs to be built by going through a methodological approach, essentially, that starts from really diving into the issue at hand. So we start from a problem. We figure out the pain points of that system that we focus on, and then we have some leverage points to ideate business models around that. The vision is that then we'll change the system to a new normal. And so that beginning bit is exactly what we're presenting here today. It's the first part of research as part of our focus in Kenya for the upcoming years, where we will build the business ecosystem that enables smallholder farmers to transition to regenerative agriculture. So I'm really proud to hand over to my colleague Ken, who has been leading this piece of work. And for the upcoming 30 minutes or so, he will take you through what we found. And afterwards, we will make sure that there's a lot of time left to have a conversation with all of you. So please keep dropping the questions in the Q&A box. Introduce yourself in the chat. And Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think Thank you, Evelyn. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you are. My name is Kenneth Kyunga, and I am a venture builder with Enview. Very excited to engage with you today to learn more on how we can future-proof our production system. And so the landscape study which we are presenting was completed in the last quarter of 2022. We interviewed over 50 individual farmers, multiple farmer groups, as well as organizations which are working in the sustainable farming sector in Kenya. So the landscape study is divided into 5 sections. The first section looking more at a more global context, understanding global population trends, global food production trends. The second section dives into the food production system in Kenya and really trying to understand where are the challenges and where are the gaps. The third section looks at some of the sustainable approaches to food production and deep dives a bit into what regenerative agriculture is. The fourth section is where we highlight more on the findings of our research, where we look at the regenerative agriculture ecosystem, the work that's being done, as well as some of the challenges that farmers are facing. And then the last section is where we really look at what are the opportunities to help farmers transition at scale. So diving right in, starting off at the global context, we see how the population has been increasing over the last few years. I think last year it was reported that we had already hit the 8 billion mark, and that trend is expected to continue growing over the next few decades. While that is happening, 690 million, more than half a billion people are experiencing starvation, and that is expected to clock 3 billion in 2050 if this trend actually continues to go the way it's going. And most of this population growth is happening in sub-Saharan Africa. And so what we see is that as sub-Saharan Africa's population is continuing to grow at the highest rate, it's also the region that's expected to be hardest hit by the effects of climate change. And so that really puts a strain on the food production systems in Africa to be able to meet that growth curve. And so, what does this mean actually for food availability globally and in Africa? If current trends are to be observed, it actually shows a very gloomy picture in terms of being able to meet the world's food needs. By 2050, there is expected to be a 17% deficit in the amount of food produced versus the amount of food that is required to feed the global population. Coming down to Africa, the situation is even more strenuous in that 41 there's expected to be a 41% deficit by 2050 in terms of the amount needed versus the amount of food that is actually produced. So it's actually quite a startling piece of statistic to go through, given that there's been so much innovation around food production over the last century. In fact, much of the explosion in global population can be attributed to the innovations around mechanization and the invention of fertilizers and pesticides. But what we have found is that the agriculture sector, the food production sector, has found itself caught in a negative feedback loop where to meet those productivity demands, we increasingly need to increase the intensity of the interventions that we employ in the food production system. And those interventions then lead to negative effects on the soil, on the climate, and this then leads to a slowing productivity. And because productivity is slowing, we again need to increase the intensity of these interventions. And so you find globally, we're now stuck in this negative feedback loop where we need to keep practicing practicing things that have negative effect on the agriculture ecosystem. And so this, of course, sets us up to a point in the future where food supply cannot meet global demand, and really puts us in a very dangerous situation, and we need to reverse this as soon as possible. And so diving now into the Kenyan food production system, because this is the scope of our work. We came across a very startling statistic on the few engagements we had, that 80% of Kenya's land is undergoing desertification. If you keep in mind that only 13% of Kenya's land is considered arable land, this actually means that at some point we'll no longer have land to grow our food, and so probably have to import all our food. And so when we look at the value chain or the food production system, it immediately becomes very clear that across the value chain, there are very, very many challenges that farmers and market system players are facing. On the production side, something that has come out quite clearly is on the harmful inputs that are actually being used in the market, and some of the negative consequences of that. The increasingly unpredictable weather has actually resulted in agricultural productivity declining by as much as 34% in the last decade. And 50% of the food that we actually produce is lost. And so what that happens is that 3 million households in Kenya are finding themselves food insecure. And so looking at what climate change has really exacerbated in terms of the situation is that the weather is increasingly becoming very unpredictable. So a study by the Kenya Met Department and University of Nairobi actually shows that over the last 30 years, the frequency of extreme weather occurrences has increased to a point where we now have an extreme weather event every year. Sometimes we have multiple weather events every year. And this means that farmers no longer have the stability that they need to actually, grow their food. And so what we try to do is to not just assume that the issues that Kenya was facing in terms of food production were homogeneous, and to actually dive into specific agroclimatic zones and really try and map out what the farmer profile in each of these zones look like. And so we developed profiles of what farmers within each of these regions look like, the kind of practices they engage in, and the kind of challenges that they face. I will not go deep into the profiles that you can do once you have availability to the study. But the idea for this was to really draw out a correlation between the kind of practices that farmers have embraced and some of the challenges that have come with that. And so we try to map out what are these unsustainable farming practices. And the key unsustainable farming practices that we found was of course, the issues of loss of biodiversity. So the focus on monocropping, the overuse or the improper use of fertilizers and other inputs, over-tilling of land, and the lack of cover crops, which means that most soils across most farms are actually exposed to the elements, and the overuse of pesticides, which means that farmers are looking for quick solutions, but these quick solutions have very detrimental long-term effects. And then there was a big challenge around seed laws, which have meant that a lot of the use of seeds has been curtailed and is now in control of seed companies as opposed to farmers. And so correlating that back to what challenges do farmers say that they experience, a lot of them have to do with increased pests. Almost every farmer that we spoke to said that pests is such a big challenge that every season that's always the thing that causes them not to have the right harvest. Second was, of course, the lack of water. I think, especially in the arid and semi-arid areas, they've experienced that rains have become increasingly sparse, and when they do come, they do not produce enough water to sustain practices. The other challenges were around market access, which is very well known, expensive inputs because a lot of the inputs we use are imported, and something that also came up was, of course, the lack of labor, because a lot of the youth are not interested in engaging in farming practices. And so we did a focus group with farmers in Makueni to really understand if farmers are making a connection between how they are farming, the practices that they have embraced, and some of the effects that could be having on the environment and could be having on their productivity and their communities. And so we engaged these farmers in Makueni, and we tried for them to paint us a picture of how they see farming has evolved over the last 30 years. Especially the older farmers, they would say things like, in the 80s, 70s, early 90s, we knew when the rains would come. We had a lot of trees, we had a lot of biodiversity. We never really faced a lot of challenges with getting enough food. But post the 90s, things became quite unreliable. We cut down a lot of our trees. Our water stations were depleted, and so now we're struggling to get water. And so we would like for us to go back to that sort of what we had in the past. We'd like for our kids or our children to experience what we experienced when we were growing up. And so this made us really see that farmers really do understand that there is something that is not working, and there needs to be a reversal, there needs to be a change. And so when we look at what are the schools of thought around how you can use agricultural practices to really reverse the damage that has been done on the planet, there are very many schools of thought that have come up. So most of you will be familiar with at least one or two of these. So conservation farming, permaculture, organic farming, agroforestry, agroecology. So all those are different schools of thought that have come up. And there's a lot of theory and knowledge around how we can use some of these approaches to reverse the damage that has been done on our farming ecosystems. But at the center of all that is, how do you work with nature? How do you farm while adding to nature's capital? And so regenerative farming has, of course, been touted as one of the most powerful approaches when it comes to doing that, or to achieving that. And so diving into what is regenerative agriculture. So there are many definitions that people have come up with for regenerative agriculture. Some of the feedback we actually got was that we should not focus on the definition of regenerative agriculture. We should focus on the outcomes of regenerative agriculture. And so for us, that's the approach that we have taken. We have the core principles, which we believe are the tenets of regenerative agriculture, that if a farmer is practicing, then they will be able to achieve these three key outcomes. And so these core principles are around minimizing the soil disturbance, maximizing crop diversity, keeping the soil covered to prevent moisture loss, rainwater harvesting to ensure that farms are resilient in times of climate change, maintaining living root, so ensuring that the soil microbiome is maintained and is active, integrating livestock to ensure that there's biodiversity, and there's also availability of the compost that is required to restore soils, and then finally minimizing the use of synthetic inputs. So not stopping, but minimizing, because stopping is not something that is as easy to achieve for a smallholder farmer. And then the outcomes, of course, is improving the soil health, fostering biodiversity and promoting economic resilience. And so regenerative agriculture has very many benefits, and these have been proven with various studies that have been done across the world. And the key ones, of course, being around increasing biodiversity, increasing the resilience of farmers and farmer ecosystems, which means that farmers are less reliant on external factors to grow their food. And that also means that they can increase their earnings because their costs are not tied to things they can't control. And of course, the most important one is the effect that regenerative agriculture has on reducing GHG emissions in the agriculture sector. And we did do a scan to see have there actually been success stories in Africa that we can look at, borrow from, and inspire us. And we found a lot of work that has already been done, and we just highlighted 6 out of the multiple cases. Just to name maybe two. An Nespresso in Ethiopia is working on a project around regenerative agriculture, and they have seen a 300% boost in yield for coffee farmers who have embraced it. In West Africa, we have Olam, which is working in the cotton value chain, and they have seen, in 5 years, farmers have seen yield increases up to 80%. So these are big names which are also seeing the benefit of actually shifting to regenerative agriculture. And so for us, what we see as the biggest benefit of regenerative agriculture, or a regenerative approach to agriculture, is the reversal of the negative feedback loop which I talked about earlier. So instead of us having to increase the intensity of our actions to get higher productivity, by adopting RA practices, we can increase our sustained production, and without having to damage the planet, we actually restore the planet, we actually restore the natural system, and then the natural system starts working for us. And then we then can reduce the intensity we put into the agriculture sector, and that then reverses that negative feedback loop. And so looking at what is happening in the regenerative agriculture space in Kenya. So these are section 4 and section 5 is where we really dive into the findings of the study that we did. Right off, we see that the regenerative agriculture space in Kenya is not very well defined, mostly around what exactly constitutes the approach to regenerative agriculture. A lot of it is interswitched or intertwined with organic farming, and so the different schools of thought sometimes also means that the practices may not be implemented as effectively as they could be. A lot of the regenerative agriculture work is being driven by programs with the different institutions working in Kenya, and so a lot of it is not yet private sector led, which also limits the effectiveness or the ability of farmers to adopt it. On the market side, regenerative agriculture is not a term that is well known or even known to consumers. Most of them are still getting acclimatized to things like organic produce. So regenerative produce is almost non-existent. So from the pull side of the consumer, that has not yet happened. It will probably most come down to on the production side to actually build a case for why this is what consumers should be having on their tables. Globally, to contrast, the global ecosystem when it comes to regenerative agriculture is sort of well defined, simply because the conversation around this has been ongoing since 1974, by when the term was first coined by the Rodale Institute. So there's a lot of there's an ecosystem that has already been built around this. But coming down to Kenya, we see that a lot of the work is around training and capacity building. Bio inputs simply because of organic farming. So there's a lot of organic inputs that have come into the market. But in terms of market access, we have very few players in the market who actually sell regenerative specific produce. I think we only found maybe two or three players in the market. A lot of it could also be going into the export market, but none really for the local consumer. And so there is, of course, a lot of opportunities to grow this ecosystem further. We engaged with a lot of organizations to understand what they're doing, and we did find that there's actually a lot of work being done to transition farmers into regenerative. And I think it's wonderful to see all these organizations that are so committed to this, and it's a foundation point for us as NVU, who are looking at building an ecosystem to see how we can then connect all this work that is being done so that it can have a positive outcome for the smallholder farmers. And so we also tried to, in our own way, define what the outcome of regenerative agriculture could be. And so what we wanted to do is to group or to come up with farmer profiles to show how a transition journey would look like. And we would do that by looking at the practices that are involved. So starting off at the very end of unsustainability, where a farmer is fully practicing conventional farming, where you find some farmers are. But what we found is that most farmers do practice some aspects of regenerative agriculture, even though they may not be aware of the concept itself. So they will be practicing some form of intercropping. They will be using organic manure. They will be using some form of they will be using some form of organic pesticide, but then they'll be mixing that with some conventional farming like heavy tilling. So this is where most farmers, most smallholder farmers are in Kenya. So we're not actually building from scratch. There is an awareness around some of these concepts in regenerative agriculture. So there is something to build upon. This star farmer that we see, or the profile of star farmer, who is a regenerative farmer, is one who practices at least these 7 practices. So they are building for farm resilience, they're employing no-till, they have cover crops, they've diversified their crops, they have at least 15 value chains. They have integrated rainwater harvesting, they have integrated livestock, and they are minimized, not stopped, but minimized the use of inorganic inputs over the course of their farming. And so when we look at what are then the opportunities for regenerative agriculture, what we need to first do is map out what does the transition journey of a farmer look like. And so here we did interview farmers who had already started the process of transition, who at different stages of transition, farmers who had either just started, farmers who had been practicing for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, etc. And so we wanted to understand what about your journey it has been difficult for you. What is it that has either stopped you from going as fast as you could? What has made your fellow farmers drop out? And so we mapped out what we define as the moments of joy and the moments of pain. So in the moments of pain and the moments of joy, both of them provide you with an understanding of where the opportunities to actually make this scale faster. And so just to highlight what we found to be the biggest moments of joy, it was around peer community. So because farmers get to work together, they feel like that's an incentive for regenerative agriculture, access to safe foods, seeing better yields, and seeing better soils. In terms of moments of pain, a lot of it is tied to the lack of hand-holding because of the amount of capacity building that's required for a farmer to fully understand the concept and practice it. a lot of the farmers felt that the support was only provided at the beginning, but then after that, there was not enough hand-holding to get them through the uncertainty. So if a farmer went through one bad harvest cycle where they did not see the intended outcomes, and they did not have someone to come and reassure them that they were on the right path, they were most likely to drop off and reverse to the conventional ways of farming. Also, at the end, or not at the end, but once a farmer had been practicing Regenag over multiple cycles, they then felt that they needed a reward from the market because they had put in the effort to actually make their food safer, not just for them, but for the community. So if they felt that there was no return on investment for the work that they had done, some farmers would drop off and decide that this was not for them. But most of the farmers we spoke to still felt that being able to grow food that is safe for them and their community was a big incentive to keep going. And you see in this slide when we tried to understand a few insights about why farmers transition. The motivation to transition for most of the farmers we spoke to was actually safe food and health. You we assumed that it would be something around better markets or better yields, but most of them said that it's actually the fact that we're growing food that's good for us and good for the community. But that could also be as a result of the way that regenerative agriculture had been packaged more towards organic practices. And then in terms of the practices that they started off with, mostly was around minimizing the use of inorganic inputs. Again, could be tied to the approach of the training that they underwent. And then the challenges that they faced mostly was around access to better markets, again, the reward for the effort, and then access to organic inputs, as well as access to the knowledge they needed. The benefits for the farmers who had been practicing Regenag was they saw a reduced cost in terms of how much they need to put in the farm. They saw a yield quantity increase, so they saw that both the quantity and the quality of the yields had increased, and also they felt that the food was safer for not just them, but also their community. And so what does this tells us? What does this tell us about what actually is needed? What are the support services that are needed to transition? And what kind of ventures should we be thinking about building? I think, as I mentioned, most the biggest barrier to actually maintaining the transition journey that we found was around knowledge. So knowledge featured in every conversation that we had with farmers who were engaging in any form of sustainable agriculture. So they wanted to be able to access the right knowledge at the right time. And they felt that was something that is not yet there. Second of all was access to inputs. So both access and affordability of the inputs. So they felt that that was something that they didn't have enough of. And then, of course, the market, and this was mostly for farmers who had been engaged in the practice for a period of time. They felt that they needed the market needed to appreciate their products more because their products were different. So there needs to be a way in which the products that are farmed regeneratively could be packaged and marketed differently so that it appreciates the effort in which they have gone through. So this is sort of showing what products or services that we should be thinking of building around. And it really focuses our efforts on that. And so where we are in the process, as Evelyn mentioned, where we are in the process, of course, we always start off with an issue analysis, which is an in-depth review of the landscape or the value chain or the system that we're trying to effect. Once we understand, once we've done the issue analysis, we'll have the gap analysis, which really tells us what is really missing, what is this thing that is needed to unlock the change. And so we have identified that we need standardized transition knowledge, we need access to markets, we need access to inputs. And so what we're building for is really having regenerative training that is coupled with access to affordable and safe inputs that then allows a farmer to have the complete package that they need to make this transition. And then on the market offtake, we would be looking at how do you then package the produce that has come from regenerative farmers in a way that the market appreciates and the farmer feels that the market has appreciated. And so that is what we're looking at in terms of ventures. Right now, we're in the process of validating some of the assumptions around those ventures. So testing out how potential business models would look like, testing out how potential products or services would look like, and testing out what are the different customers that would be targeting with these products. And so that is really part of our methodology, looking at even how we've done it with the previous ventures that we've built. We we work at making a system work better and be more efficient. So we will pilot new business models as we're doing with Shambani Pro, which is a value addition venture that we're building in Embu. We will then, once we have proven these business models, we'll then build those business models into impact-driven companies such as Soko Fresh and Taimba. And hopefully those companies will have a real market change. And then with that market change, we can have a sustainable and efficient system that helps smallholder farmers. And so we it's a lot of work, and it's work that we have taken upon us to undertake and build this. And we invite you to work with us and to partner with us to help us achieve this. That's the end of the presentation. So I think I can pause here for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ken. That was yeah, just for sharing such a clear overview of the work that we've been doing in the past few months. Yeah, so as you say, we can now move to the Q&A section of the webinar. At the same time, I'm dropping a link in the chat box where you can download the full publication. You can also register there for updates from Enview if you want to stay in the loop of developments. My colleague Arpana has also dropped the link to our LinkedIn in the chat as well. So there's many ways to stay in touch with us. And yeah, so questions. Would also love to hear it if you see potential to collaborate, or if you feel that we can have potential partnerships. If you want to maybe point out something that we've missed, we're always open to receive feedback. So let me see. So I got a remark that the Q&A box was it wasn't easy to find it, or someone couldn't find it. If that's the case for you as well, just feel free to drop your questions in the chat. There has been a question in the chat a little bit around methodology, Ken. So it's maybe you can share a little bit of background on how we went about gathering the data. And the question from Hannes is, what is the number of respondents for these transition journey insights?
Great, thanks. So in terms of the methodology, it was a combination of desk research as well as primary research. So for the primary research, we focused on two sets of groups. So farmers who were not practicing any form of sustainable farming. So this would be fully conventional farming. And then we had another set of farmers who were practicing some form of sustainable farming, be it organic farming, be it regenerative agriculture, be it permaculture. So in terms of respondents, we had a total of 50 respondents in terms of the interviews that we did for the farmers. We also did 2 focus groups with farmers, with each group having 10 farmers. One farmer group was practicing organic farming, and then one farmer group was a conventional farmer group. We also interviewed multiple stakeholders within the sustainable agriculture space, so the NGOs and the different institutions that are in this space, just to get their insights. So this provided more of qualitative feedback on what's happening in the field. So that's in terms of our methodology, that's how we went about it. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think that was pretty clear. I saw a raised hand. It's something actually that we think we can do because we have a good amount of time. So if you do want to ask your question in person, you can just raise your hand and I can unmute you. I'm seeing a question in the chat and I'm seeing a raised hand. Let me go to the chat first and then Christopher, I'll get to you. Have you done any analysis on the potential for carbon finance to support the transition? So, for example, do regenerative ag practices sequester carbon? What are the CO2 equivalent, the tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare values, and how does this compare to the cost of transition? Good question.
Very good question. I think in terms of carbon financing, it's something that based on the desktop research that we did and engagement with a couple of experts, is a big component of regenerative agriculture. In terms of the specifics on how that could be a potential business model, I think it's something that we did not incorporate for this particular study, but it's something that as we are now in the process of transitioning farmers, is something that we have been built into our M&E work, trying to really understand what are the numbers around sequestration, and is this now a potential model that could, in some case, subsidize the transition costs for farmers. So I think that's the approach that we've taken for now.
Thank you. Christopher, I'm going to unmute you. I think you'll also have to unmute on your own side, and you can ask your question.
Hi there, can you hear me, Evelyn?
Yeah.
Great, Chris from Acumen. Thank you both for a terrific presentation. My question is related to the market incentivization piece, which feels like a sort of a big challenge here, and wondered if in your assessment of regenerative, you also got a sense of sort of value for organic certification, and whether or not there was thought about trying to piggyback the regenerative work sort of off the premiums that organic certification might be able to offer as a pull-through, as an incentive for farmers, and then maybe adding in the regenerative components on top of the organic work, just to sort of to gather that momentum and incentive for the smallholder farmer that way. Is there a differentiation between organic and regenerative certification, I guess, is the overarching question.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, there is a differentiation both locally and internationally on organic and regenerative certification. I think for organic, of course, it's well developed. There are multiple standards. Different regions or different countries have their own standards, such as EU organic or USDA organic, as well as other standards which incorporate aspects of organic farming. So I think for that is very well defined, even locally. We also have our own standard known as Kilimo High, which certifies organic farmers. For region certification, we only found maybe one or two, and the best known one was the RAO, which is being driven by a consortium of different institutions. It's still, I would say, a work in progress. I don't think it has sort of the global acceptance, because mostly it's driven out of the US. And when it comes to these certification things, they can get quite territorial. Each region wants to have its own certification. So in terms of region certification, would say that one is still work in progress. There's still a lot more to be done. In terms of piggybacking with organic certification, it's something that we considered in terms of how do you then show that this is something that has been grown regeneratively, right? So it was a bit of a challenge because the focus of organic farming, purely organic farming, is very different from the focus of regenerative agriculture. So if you narrow down your regenerative practices simply to organic farming, you may lose out on the benefits that could accrue from embracing the entirety of what regenerative agriculture is. And so there could be a case to be made of how you build a certification, but it's still not clear if you can actually do that with using organic, especially in Kenya, using the organic standard as a base, because the outcomes are very different. What we think, or what we think the approach could be, on the market side, it could be two things. One thing could be by embracing regenerative agriculture, it has been shown that a farmer can actually reduce their costs significantly, right? So if we found a way or found a model in which a farmer can transition to regenerative practices that actually means that their cost of production is equal or lower to conventional farming, then they may not need the market reward in terms of price. They may only need a market reward in terms of just a recognition that their produce is different. So it is possible to achieve that through regenerative agriculture. The other approach could be that the retail or the consumer facing consumer facing institutions, so the retailers, etc., then have structures which incentivize consumers to actually uptake regenerative produce. So they are doing sort of the push of that. And so over time, that creates a demand for regeneratively grown produce in a way that then provides that reward that the farmer is looking for.
Thank you, Ken. Chris, I hope that you gave Iman was a very, very elaborate answer, but that's also a very tricky subject, I guess, organic certification already still is. Would love to continue the conversation with you at some point, if you'd like to. I have another hand, and I'll unmute you, Ralph, and then I have a couple of questions in the chat box. Ralph, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Ralph Roethaert from the World Vegetable Center. Thank you, Kenneth, for a very interesting presentation on regenerative agriculture, the position in the world, the challenges, and the way forward. You concluded with very, very strong points, and extracting from that, you recommended that we need to work on a knowledge base, but also access to markets and access to inputs. So on the area of access to inputs, I wonder whether you got a little bit more insights in terms of how to push that. because access to inputs of biopesticides, a lot of biopesticides, commercial biopesticides, have a limited shelf life. So that is one of the challenges that a lot of the manufacturers deal with. They cannot just distribute and make sure that all the shelves are as full as possible, like supermarkets would do with their products, for instance. And the other thing is the reputation that producers of biopesticides deal with. Biopesticides are not 100% killing insects, or they might be killing and dealing with diseases on a longer term. Yeah, you might see the benefits after some days rather than instantaneously. And if farmers do not use biopesticides correctly, it might actually create a negative feedback, and so that's also why producers of biopesticides are hesitant to just throw them out in the open, and want to very target those outlets and agro dealers who can also give knowledge together, disseminate the knowledge and as well as the products.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. Yeah, I think you did actually mention the way in which even when we spoke to a lot of these producers, they say that for access to inputs, it has to be coupled with the knowledge bit. So just selling biopesticides, biofertilizers, or any organic inputs without coupling it with the right knowledge is counterintuitive, because there is an issue of usability and how to apply. So the way in which we are looking at addressing this is that the venture product or the venture concept is combining knowledge and access to inputs. So those two go hand in hand together as they're being provided to the farmer. So a farmer does not get inputs without having been trained on not just how to use the inputs, but the larger context of maybe why are the pests, why are you having pest issues in your farm? What are the other solutions or what are the other ways in which you could prevent these pests invading your farm? And in terms of how do you then take care of the infestation once it comes? How do you use these biopesticides effectively? And also, how do you maybe when, let's say, when the infestation is high, how do you incorporate or use the existing synthetic pesticides, but in a safe way that then does not harm your farm ecosystem? So I think the difficult part is how to combine the knowledge and the access to inputs, and that's what we are then trying to build a business model around, because that's the only way then this problem can be solved.
Thanks. So Ken, we have a few more minutes left, and I have 5 questions. I'm going to tell the participants that we're closing the questions for now. I hope we can still make it through the 5 that we have here. So there's 2 questions around price, slightly different ones. Hannes is asking, how do you balance the tension between making healthy food affordable to Kenya consumers and paying premium prices to farmers in the ventures you are building? And the other question is, farmers in Africa, posed by Chef, farmers in Africa a lot of the time do not get a fair price for their products, and even conventional farming does often not provide an ROI in combination with lack of access to inputs and finance. And so if RA or regenerative ag is even more difficult or expensive, how do you see that work?
I'm sorry, Evelyn, I missed the last part.
The last part is essentially if farmers already right now don't get a fair price for their product because conventional farming doesn't provide an ROI, then how will it work if they're farming regeneratively?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think it's obviously I can't say that I have the right answer just yet, because again, we are trying to develop a business model or a business case in which you can transition a farmer to adopt regenerative agriculture, and the cost of production of the farmer is on par or lower than conventional farming. So then the farmer can see the business case for that. That would be what the first venture would be looking at. It would be looking at how do you make the production, the regenerative production, cost effective, right? The second venture or the second solution would be looking at things on the market side. So how do you then, what form or what model do you use to reward or to provide that reward to a farmer who has engaged uh, in regenerative agriculture? So that is what now the venture is trying to trying to build a business case or a business model around that. So I wouldn't say that I have the answer. That is the process that we're in right now to actually figure out how would this work.
Great. Two more questions. My colleague Arpana, in the meantime, has answered someone in the chat. One is the remark, which is interesting. I find the language used from Dungu. I find the language used to describe regenerative agriculture too complex and tends to leave many farmers confused. Is there an effort to translate some of these concepts into local idiom and languages?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, for the purpose of this presentation, of course, we use these terminologies, but I think the way we work with farmers is regenerative agriculture is highly contextual. It's something that is very community driven. So the way in which we package the knowledge that we transfer is actually built on the knowledge that the farmers they themselves have. So and in that way, it becomes very intuitive for farmers to actually understand how to farm in the natural system, because especially for the older ones, that's how they have always been farming, in the 70s and 80s. So really trying to bring that back really is very intuitive for them, and they get it straight away. So I think, yeah, it's something that needs to be done more often.
Yeah, I also find it a really good point. And then a really nice one to wrap up. Victoria asks, after the research, did you feel that more needs to be done on consumer knowledge too? As others have said above, without this knowledge at the consumer level, how will the demand grow? And if most consumers don't want to pay premium prices, would they buy regeneratively ag farmed produce if they really don't understand the benefits? If they don't really understand the benefits?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, right? So just looking at organic farming, which has been there for quite a while, and still not much is the consumers may be aware, but the demand is still not at that level, simply because maybe the prices are prohibitive. I think my thinking it would be that we may need to move away from in the incentive structure where we're trying to always trying to use the language of premium and paying farmers premium, because I think that has had a negative effect on how farmers approach food production. I think it's more of actually practicing sustainable farming cost effective or affordable, so that there needs not be a discussion on the food I'm eating is not healthy, but I can't afford to eat, healthy food. It should just be that the food I'm eating is healthy and is affordable, because there is a production system that is healthy and sustainable, that gives me something that is healthy and sustainable and affordable. So my thinking is that that's what we should be working towards. How do we make sustainable farming affordable enough that it doesn't have to be a conversation on the consumer side? It's wishful thinking, maybe, but I think ideally, in an ideal world, that is what we should be designing for.
I love that we end on a note of an ideal world. Thank you so much, Ken, for taking us through all of the work. Thanks to all the participants for sticking with us. Downloading the documentation will also give you this last slide. Will give you the opportunity to also directly contact us and continue the conversation. Yeah, looking forward to continuing on this journey and engaging with all of you. Thank you. Have a really nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.